Margaret Elizabeth Holloway trembled as the autumn wind cut through her tattered shawl, her trunk sitting forlornly beside her on the deserted train platform in Silver Creek, Wyoming Territory, 1873. She had waited for 3 hours past the agreed meeting time. The letter from her would-be groom now crumpled in her gloved hand, its promises feeling as empty as the horizon stretching before her. The frontier town of Silver Creek seemed to have turned its back on her, with only the occasional curious glance from passers-by who hurried along the wooden boardwalks. Margaret's heart sank with each passing minute. Samuel Jenkins, her mail-order fiancé, had described himself as a successful shopkeeper eager to welcome his Eastern bride. Now it appeared he had abandoned her to the mercy of the Wyoming wilderness. As the sun began its descent behind the distant mountains, casting long shadows across the weathered platform, Margaret fought back tears. 22 years old and alone, having left behind everything familiar in Boston, her position as a schoolteacher, her modest room in a respectable boarding house, and the grave of her recently deceased father. The last of her family gone, she had pinned her hopes on Samuel's letters, each one painting a picture of a new life in the West. "Madam, you've been standing there since noon." The station master approached, his face a mixture of concern and suspicion. "Train's gone, won't be another till Tuesday next." "I'm waiting for someone," Margaret replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "Mr. Samuel Jenkins, perhaps you know him." The station master's expression shifted, and he removed his cap, twisting it in his weathered hands. "Jenkins, you say? Samuel Jenkins." The man's hesitation told Margaret everything she needed to know before he even spoke the words. "Miss, I'm afraid Mr. Jenkins passed on 3 weeks ago. Pneumonia took him fast. Town buried him up on the hill." He gestured vaguely toward a distant slope. "Didn't nobody write to tell you?" The blood drained from Margaret's face. "No," she whispered. "No one wrote." The station master shuffled uncomfortably. "There's a widow's boarding house down the way, though it ain't much." "Perhaps you could. I have exactly $4.16 to my name," Margaret interrupted, her voice hollow. "I spent everything else on the train ticket." The weight of her situation crashed down upon her shoulders. No groom, no home, no prospects, and night approaching in a strange town. Her body began to shake more violently, partly from the cold and partly from desperation. It was then that the sound of hoofbeats reached her ears. A lone rider appeared at the far end of the main street, his silhouette backlit by the setting sun. The station master squinted against the light. "Well, I'll be," he muttered. "That's Mitchell Blackwood." The rider approached at an unhurried pace, the powerful dun stallion beneath him kicking up dust from the street. As he drew closer, Margaret could make out a tall, broad-shouldered man with a dark hat pulled low over his features. His duster coat billowed slightly in the wind, revealing glimpses of the gun belt at his waist. The station master nodded in greeting as the rider reined in beside the platform. "Mitch, didn't expect to see you in town so soon." The man called Mitchell tipped his hat slightly, his gaze moving from the station master to Margaret. His eyes were a startling blue against his sun-darkened skin, and a few days' worth of stubble shadowed his strong jaw. He studied her with quiet intensity. "Tom," he acknowledged the station master with a nod. "Just finished business with the cattle buyer in Cheyenne." His voice was deep and measured, with a slight rasp that suggested he used it sparingly. Margaret felt herself being assessed by those penetrating eyes. She straightened her spine and lifted her chin, unwilling to appear as desperate as she felt despite her shivering. "This here's Miss Holloway," the station master said. "Come all the way from Boston to marry Samuel Jenkins." A flicker of recognition passed across Mitchell's face. "Jenkins is dead." "Yes, just found that out myself," Margaret replied, unable to keep a slight edge from her voice. "Apparently news travels slowly to Boston." Mitchell dismounted in one fluid motion, tying his horse to the hitching post. Up close, he was even more imposing, well over 6 feet tall, with the lean, muscular build of a man who worked hard for his living. "You have someplace to go?" he asked directly. Margaret hesitated, pride warring with practicality. "I was just discussing options with Mr. Tom Wilkins." the station master supplied. Mr. Wilkins, she finished. Though I find my choices somewhat limited at present. Mitchell exchanged a look with the station master before turning back to her. I knew Jenkins. He wasn't much, but he wasn't dishonest. He would have wanted someone to help you. That's very kind, but I don't accept charity from strangers, Margaret said, even as another gust of wind sent a violent shiver through her body. A ghost of a smile touched Mitchell's lips. Not offering charity, Miss Holloway. He glanced at her trunk. Jenkins owned a store. Someone needs to run it. Town needs it. Margaret blinked in surprise. I don't understand. Mitchell studied her for a long moment. Jenkins had no family, store's just sitting there. Town council's been looking for someone to take it over. But I know nothing about running a store, Margaret protested. Can you read, write, do figures? Mitchell asked bluntly. Of course, I was a school teacher in Boston. Mitchell nodded as if that settled matters. Then you can learn the rest. He paused, then added, store has living quarters upstairs. Clean, proper. The station master cleared his throat. It's a good offer, miss, better than the alternatives. Margaret's mind raced. This unexpected proposal offered shelter and potential employment, but she knew nothing about this man or this town. Yet what choice did she have? Night was falling, and with it, the temperature. Why would you help me, Mr. Blackwood? She asked cautiously. Those blue eyes held hers steadily. Jenkins was my friend. I give my word to watch over what was his. He paused. That includes the woman he sent for. Something in his tone made Margaret realize this was no casual offer. In this man's world, a given word meant something. Still, she hesitated. I cannot simply claim another man's property. You're not claiming it, Mitchell interrupted. You're saving it. Town needs that store. Kids need schooling too. He glanced at the darkening sky. Decision time, Miss Holloway, night's coming. In that moment, Margaret made the first truly impulsive decision of her carefully ordered life. Very well, Mr. Blackwood. I accept your offer temporarily, until I can establish more permanent arrangements. Mitchell nodded once, then lifted her heavy trunk as if it weighed nothing, securing it behind his saddle. He turned and extended a gloved hand to her. You'll ride with me, he said. It wasn't a question. Gathering her skirts, Margaret allowed him to help her onto the horse, settling sideways in front of him. His arm reached around her to grasp the reins, creating a secure circle that somehow felt both invasive and reassuring. Hold tight, he instructed, and then they were moving, leaving the station master and the empty platform behind. As they rode down the main street, Margaret became acutely aware of the curious stares from the townsfolk. The town was larger than she'd initially thought, with businesses lining both sides of the street: a saloon, a blacksmith, a hotel, and various shops. People paused in their evening activities to watch the notorious Mitchell Blackwood riding with an unknown woman in his arms. They're staring, Margaret murmured, uncomfortable with the attention. Small town, Mitchell replied simply. News is currency. After a short ride, they stopped in front of a 2-story clapboard building with a sign reading Jenkins General Merchandise. The windows were dark, and a notice on the door announced the store's closure due to proprietors passing. Mitchell dismounted first, then reached up to help Margaret down. His hands were strong and sure at her waist, and for an instant, she was disturbingly conscious of his nearness, of the scent of leather and horses and open prairie that clung to him. He retrieved her trunk and led her to the door, producing a key from his pocket. Town council gave me this. To look after things. The lock turned with a creak, and Mitchell pushed the door open, stepping aside to let Margaret enter first. The interior was dim until he lit a lamp on the counter, revealing shelves of goods, canned foods, tools, fabric, and sundries all covered in a fine layer of dust. Living quarters are upstairs, Mitchell said, indicating a narrow staircase at the back of the store. I'll bring your trunk up. Margaret followed him up the stairs to find a surprisingly comfortable apartment consisting of a small parlor, a kitchen area, a bedroom, and a tiny washroom. The furniture was simple but sturdy: a table with 4 chairs, a settee, a rocking chair, and through the bedroom door, she glimpsed a bed with a patchwork quilt. Mitchell set her trunk down and stood awkwardly in the center of the room, suddenly seeming less sure of himself in this domestic setting. There's wood for the stove, he said, gesturing to a small box near the cast iron cooking stove. Should be enough for tonight. I'll bring more tomorrow. Margaret's exhaustion hit her all at once. Thank you, Mr. Blackwood. Your kindness is unexpected. Something flashed in his eyes, perhaps amusement, perhaps something else. Don't thank me yet, Miss Holloway. Town will expect that store open within the week. I see, she replied, too tired to argue. And what does the town expect of you regarding me? Mitchell considered her question carefully before answering. They'll expect me to honor my word to Jenkins, to look after what was his. He moved toward the stairs, which means I'll be back tomorrow with supplies. Before she could respond, he descended the stairs, his boots making heavy sounds on the wooden steps. Margaret heard the store door open and close, followed by the sound of hoofbeats fading into the distance. Alone at last, she sank onto the settee and allowed herself a moment of overwhelming emotion. Tears came, hot and fast tears for the future she'd imagined that would never be, for her lost home in Boston, and for the terrifying uncertainty that stretched before her. When the tears subsided, Margaret rose and explored her new living space more thoroughly. The kitchen cupboards contained basic provisions: flour, sugar, coffee, some dried beans. In the bedroom, she found clean linens in a chest and a Bible on the nightstand. Someone, likely Mitchell Blackwood, had prepared for her arrival. After washing her face in the basin and changing into her nightgown, Margaret climbed into the unfamiliar bed. As she lay in the darkness, listening to the strange sounds of a frontier town settling for the night, she wondered about the man who had claimed her at the station. Not as a bride, not exactly, but as a responsibility, a promise to fulfill. Mitchell Blackwood was clearly respected, perhaps even feared, in Silver Creek. Yet he had shown her nothing but decency. Still, there was something in those piercing blue eyes that spoke of experiences she couldn't begin to understand, of a life lived by different rules than those she knew in Boston. Margaret's last thought before exhaustion claimed her was that she had exactly 6 days to learn how to run a general store in the Wyoming territory. And somehow, she suspected that would be the least of her challenges in Silver Creek. Morning arrived with harsh clarity, sunlight streaming through the uncurtained windows. Margaret woke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where she was until the events of the previous day came rushing back. She dressed quickly in one of her plain work dresses, pinned her chestnut hair into a simple knot, and went downstairs to survey the store. In daylight, the layer of dust was even more apparent, as were the disorganized shelves and haphazard inventory. Margaret took a deep breath, overwhelmed by the task before her, but determined to begin. She had always found solace in order and routine, and she would create both here. She had just located a broom behind the counter when the store door opened, the bell above it jangling. Mitchell Blackwood stood in the doorway, his tall frame nearly filling it, his arms laden with parcels. "Good morning, Mr. Blackwood," Margaret said, smoothing her skirts nervously. "Mitch," he corrected, setting the packages on the counter. "Nobody calls me Mr. Blackwood except the banker and the preacher." Margaret nodded, unwilling to concede the familiarity just yet. "I see you've brought supplies. Food," he clarified. "Coffee, bacon, eggs, bread. Figured you hadn't eaten." As if on cue, Margaret's stomach growled loudly, causing a flush to rise to her cheeks. "That was thoughtful of you." Mitch's expression remained impassive, but she thought she detected a softening around his eyes. "Need to eat. Lots to do." "Yes, well, I was just getting started on the cleaning," Margaret replied, gesturing with the broom. Mitch glanced around the dusty store. "Got help coming. 3 women from town, friends of Jenkins. They'll help get the place ready." Margaret's pride bristled slightly. "I'm perfectly capable. Store needs to open soon," Mitch interrupted. "Town needs it. Can't do it alone." Before she could respond, the bell jangled again, and 3 women entered, their expressions openly curious. The oldest, a plump woman with gray streaked hair, stepped forward first. "Well now, you must be Samuel's intended. I'm Martha Wilson, and these are my daughters, Beatrice and Clara. We've come to help get this place in order." Martha's direct approach was somewhat disarming, and Margaret found herself extending her hand. "Margaret Holloway." "I'm pleased to meet you, though I wish it were under different circumstances." Martha clasped her hand warmly. Samuel was a good man, quiet sort, kept to himself mostly but honest in his dealings. He spoke of you often after your letters started coming. A lump formed in Margaret's throat. I never had the chance to meet him. Life's like that out here, Martha said matter-of-factly. Hard and unpredictable, but we take care of our own. She gestured to Mitch. And if Mitchell Blackwood's vouching for you, that's good enough for most folks in Silver Creek. Mitch shifted uncomfortably under the attention. I'll leave you women to it then. Got fencing to mend at the north pasture. He turned to go, but Martha stopped him. Now don't you disappear for days, Mitchell. This girl's going to need help with the store accounts and suppliers. Samuel always said you had a head for business, despite your best efforts to hide it. A muscle twitched in Mitch's jaw, but he nodded. I'll be back this evening. Need anything from the mercantile in the meantime? Curtains, Margaret said suddenly. For the upstairs windows. Something like surprise flickered across Mitch's face before he nodded again and departed. Martha clapped her hands briskly. Well then, let's get to work. Clara, start with the windows. Beatrice, help Miss Holloway with the shelves. I'll see to the living quarters upstairs. For the next several hours, the four women worked tirelessly. Margaret learned that Martha was the wife of the town doctor, and her daughters, both in their early 20s, helped with his practice. As they worked, they shared the history of Silver Creek, founded 15 years earlier when silver was discovered in the nearby mountains, though the mines had since played out, leaving ranching and farming as the town's primary industries. Mitchell Blackwood owns the largest ranch in the county, Beatrice told her as they scrubbed the counter. The Circle B, 5,000 acres and the best breeding stock this side of the Mississippi. How did he come to be friends with Mr. Jenkins? Margaret asked, curious about the connection between the prosperous rancher and the modest shopkeeper. Saved his life, Clara replied from her perch on a ladder where she was washing windows. 5 years back, Samuel's wagon overturned in Coyote Creek during the spring floods. Mitch happened by, dove in, and pulled him out. They weren't exactly friends, Martha added, descending the stairs with a basket of linens. But out here, saving a man's life creates a bond. When Samuel took sick, Mitch was the one who rode 15 miles through a blizzard to fetch my husband. Margaret absorbed this information, the image of Mitchell Blackwood becoming more complex with each revelation. He seems formidable, Martha snorted. That's one word for him. Man's been through more than most, fought in the war, lost his family to Comanche raiders before that. Built that ranch from nothing but grit and determination. He's not married, Margaret asked, then immediately regretted the question when all three Wilson women exchanged knowing glances. No, Martha said carefully. Mitchell keeps to himself mostly, polite to women, respectful but distant. Half the unmarried females in the county have set their caps for him over the years, but he's shown no interest. I wasn't implying, Margaret began, flustered. Of course not, dear, Martha patted her hand. Now, let's see about an inventory of what's here, so you'll know what to order when the supply drummer comes through next week. By late afternoon, the store had been transformed. The floors gleamed, the windows sparkled, and the merchandise had been organized and displayed properly. Martha had made the upstairs apartment cozy with fresh linens and the few personal touches Margaret had brought with her from Boston. As the Wilson women prepared to leave, Martha took Margaret aside. Sunday services are at 10. The whole town will be there and they'll all want to meet you. Best to get the introductions over with at once. Thank you, Margaret said sincerely. I don't know how I would have managed without your help today. Martha smiled warmly. That's how we survive out here, dear, together. She hesitated, then added, and don't worry about Mitchell. His bark is worse than his bite, though I wouldn't say that to his face. After they left, Margaret sat behind the counter, studying the ledger books she'd found. Samuel Jenkins had been meticulous in his record keeping, which was a relief. The store appeared to be modestly profitable, serving not only the town but also the surrounding farms and ranches. If she could maintain his system, perhaps she could indeed make a living here. The bell jangled again as dusk was falling, and Mitch entered, carrying a bundle of fabric. Curtains, he said gruffly, placing them on the counter. Mrs. Wilson at the mercantile said they'd do. Thank you, Margaret replied, fingering the calico print. They're perfect. Mitch looked around the store, taking in the transformation. Place looks good. The Wilsons were very helpful, Margaret said. I've been studying Mr. Jenkins' ledgers. The business seems sound. Mitch nodded. Samuel knew what he was doing, built this place from a tent store when the town was new. He paused, then added, Town council meets tomorrow night. They'll want to talk to you about taking over the store proper. Legal-like. Margaret's pulse quickened. So soon, but I've only just arrived. Town needs the store, Mitch said simply, as if that explained everything. Jenkins had no kin, left no will that we know of. But he paid for your passage here, intended you as his wife. By frontier reckoning, you've got the strongest claim. I see, Margaret said, though she wasn't sure she did. Everything moved so quickly here, decisions made with a pragmatism that bordered on ruthlessness. I brought dinner, Mitch added, producing another package from his saddlebag. From the hotel restaurant, thought you might be too busy to cook. The unexpected thoughtfulness touched Margaret. That was kind of you. For the first time, Mitch looked uncomfortable with her gratitude. Just being practical, can't run a store if you starve. Despite his gruff response, Margaret smiled. Well, I appreciate it nonetheless, would you? Would you care to join me? There appears to be plenty. Mitch hesitated, clearly weighing his response. Finally, he nodded. Need to go over the suppliers with you anyway, and how to work the ordering system. They moved upstairs to the small table in the kitchen area. Margaret found plates and utensils while Mitch unwrapped the package, revealing 2 portions of roast beef, potatoes, and green beans. As they ate, Mitch explained the system of ordering supplies for the store, which companies were reliable, which teamsters could be trusted, and how to negotiate prices. Margaret listened attentively, asking questions when necessary and taking mental notes. You catch on quick, Mitch observed as they finished their meal. I've always been a good student, Margaret replied, though I'm more accustomed to being the teacher. Town could use a proper teacher, Mitch said thoughtfully. Been making do with the preacher's wife, but she's expecting their 4th child and can't keep up. Margaret's interest was piqued. How many children are there in Silver Creek? 26 of school age, last count, maybe more with the new families that settled this spring. I see, Margaret said, considering the possibilities. Running the store would be demanding, but perhaps she could offer lessons a few days a week. It would be a way to use her training and to integrate herself into the community. Mitch rose to leave, but paused at the top of the stairs. Lock up after I go. Town's mostly peaceful, but there's always drifters passing through. I will, Margaret promised. Mitch seemed on the verge of saying something else, but instead merely nodded. I'll come by tomorrow afternoon, take you to the council meeting. After he left, Margaret hung the new curtains, grateful for the privacy they provided. As she prepared for bed, she reflected on the whirlwind her life had become. 2 days ago, she had been on a train heading west to marry a man she knew only through letters. Now that man was dead, and she was potentially about to become a shopkeeper in a frontier town, under the puzzling protection of a rancher who seemed to consider her a duty to fulfill. Margaret fell asleep wondering what Samuel Jenkins had written about her in his letters to the people of Silver Creek, and what exactly they expected of the bride who had arrived too late. The next morning, Margaret woke with renewed determination. After a simple breakfast, she returned to the store ledgers, familiarizing herself with the inventory and pricing. By midday, she felt confident enough to open the store doors, if only to announce to the town that Jenkins General Merchandise would soon be back in business. The response was immediate. Within minutes of unlocking the doors, customers began to arrive, first hesitantly, then in a steady stream. Women needing fabric and notions, a farmer requiring nails, a young boy sent for sugar and coffee. Margaret handled each transaction carefully, consulting the ledger when necessary, grateful for Samuel's detailed records. You're doing just fine, an elderly man assured her after she apologized for her slowness in finding the tobacco he wanted. Samuel took 3 days to learn where everything was, and he stocked the shelves himself. By late afternoon, Margaret was exhausted but exhilarated. She had successfully operated the store on her own, even if somewhat slowly, and the residents of Silver Creek had been patient and welcoming. She had just closed the cash drawer after her final sale when Mitch appeared in the doorway. You opened, he stated, his expression unreadable. It seemed the practical thing to do, Margaret replied, using his own logic. The town needs the store. Something that might have been approval flickered in his eyes. Council meets at 7, hotel dining room, need to clean up and change first. Margaret glanced down at her dusty dress. Yes, I suppose I should present myself properly. I'll be back at 6:45, Mitch said, turning to leave. Mr. Blackwood, Margaret called after him. Thank you for everything you've done. He paused, his broad shoulders tense beneath his worn leather vest. Just keeping my word, he said without turning around, and then he was gone. Margaret closed the store and hurried upstairs to prepare. She washed thoroughly, then donned her best dress, a dark blue poplin with modest lace trim at the collar and cuffs. She arranged her hair in a more elaborate style than she had worn for working in the store, securing it with tortoiseshell combs that had belonged to her mother. When Mitch returned, his appearance had changed as well. He wore a clean white shirt under a black vest, his usual trail-worn trousers replaced by darker, newer ones. He had shaved, revealing a strong jawline previously hidden beneath stubble. His dark hair, still damp from washing, was combed neatly back from his forehead. He paused momentarily when he saw her, something shifting in his gaze. You look proper, he said finally. Margaret wasn't sure if it was a compliment, but she accepted it as such. As do you. They walked side by side down the main street toward the hotel, Margaret acutely aware of the curious glances from townspeople they passed. Mitch seemed oblivious to the attention, or perhaps simply accustomed to it. The council, Margaret said as they approached the hotel. What should I expect? 5 men, Mitch replied. Mayor Forbes owns the bank, Reverend Davis you'll meet Sunday, Doc Wilson you know of, Judge Parker handles legal matters, and me. Margaret stopped short. You're on the town council, Mitch shrugged, looking uncomfortable. Largest landowner. Comes with responsibilities I didn't ask for. I see, Margaret said, trying to process this new information. The man escorting her would also be passing judgment on her fitness to take over the store. Will you recuse yourself given your involvement in my situation? Mitch's eyebrows rose slightly. No need. Council knows I brought you to the store. Nothing improper about it. Margaret wasn't so certain, but she had no time to argue as they entered the hotel. The dining room had been cleared except for one large table where 4 men sat waiting. They rose as Margaret entered. Mayor Forbes, a portly man with a magnificent mustache, stepped forward first. Miss Holloway, welcome to Silver Creek. We're sorry for the circumstances that brought you here, but pleased you've decided to stay. Thank you, Mayor, Margaret replied. Though I haven't exactly decided anything yet, I understand that's the purpose of this meeting. Judge Parker, a stern-faced man with iron gray hair, gestured for her to sit. Indeed it is, Miss Holloway. We need to determine the disposition of Samuel Jenkins' property and your role in it. For the next hour, Margaret answered questions about her background, her relationship with Samuel Jenkins, and her intentions regarding the store. She explained her training as a teacher, her experience handling accounts for her father's small printing business in Boston, and her willingness to learn what she didn't know. The legal situation is unusual, Judge Parker admitted. Jenkins paid for your passage and intended you as his bride, which gives you a moral claim if not strictly a legal one. However, without a will, and with no known relatives coming forward, the property would normally revert to the town. I understand, Margaret said, keeping her voice steady despite her disappointment. I'm grateful for your hospitality thus far, and I'll make arrangements to move on as soon as. That's not what we're suggesting, Mayor Forbes interrupted. The town needs that store, Miss Holloway. And from what Mitchell tells us, you handled yourself admirably today. Mitch, who had been silent throughout the proceedings, spoke up. Opened the store on her own initiative. Customers were satisfied. Indeed, Reverend Davis said, his kind eyes crinkling at the corners. Mrs. Wilson spoke highly of your organizational skills as well. What we propose, Doc Wilson continued, is that you continue to operate the store with the town's blessing. After 6 months, if all goes well, we can discuss a more permanent arrangement, perhaps even transferring the deed to your name. Margaret was taken aback by the offer. That's extremely generous. It's practical, Mayor Forbes corrected. A closed store helps no one. An operating store serves the town and provides you with a living. There is one condition, Judge Parker added, his expression grave. Frontier towns survive on stability and propriety. A young, unmarried woman living alone above a store might raise eyebrows in some quarters. Margaret stiffened. I assure you, sir, my conduct has always been beyond reproach. No one doubts that, Reverend Davis said soothingly. But for your own protection and reputation, we would suggest a chaperone of sorts. Perhaps one of the Wilson girls could stay with you, at least initially. That won't be necessary, Mitch said suddenly, his deep voice cutting through the conversation. All eyes turned to him in surprise. I gave my word to Jenkins to look after what was his. That includes Miss Holloway's reputation. What exactly are you proposing, Mitchell? Judge Parker asked, his eyes narrowing. Mitch met the judge's gaze steadily. I'm proposing a marriage of convenience, protects Miss Holloway's reputation, gives her legal standing in the community, fulfills my promise to Jenkins. The room fell silent. Margaret stared at Mitch in shock, unable to process his words. A marriage of convenience, to a man she'd known for barely 2 days. Mitchell, Doc Wilson said carefully, that's a rather extreme solution. It's the most practical one, Mitch countered. Miss Holloway needs protection and legal standing. I've got responsibilities to the town and to Jenkins' memory, solves both problems. But Margaret finally found her voice, Mr. Blackwood. You cannot simply, it's your decision, Mitch interrupted, turning to face her directly. I'm offering a business arrangement, nothing more. You get the store and the protection of my name. I fulfill my obligation to Jenkins, and the town gets its store back. Everyone benefits. Margaret's mind raced. The proposal was outrageous, completely contrary to everything she had been raised to believe about marriage. And yet, wasn't this exactly what she had been prepared to do with Samuel Jenkins? Marry a man she knew only through letters, for the security and opportunity he offered. I would need time to consider, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Of course, Reverend Davis said, shooting Mitch a reproving look. This is hardly a decision to be made hastily. 1 week, Judge Parker declared. The town can wait that long for an answer. In the meantime, Miss Holloway may continue to operate the store and will postpone any final decisions about the property. The meeting adjourned shortly after, with the council members offering Margaret awkward goodbyes. Mitch remained silent, his expression unreadable as he escorted her back to the store. They walked in tense silence until they reached the store's door. Margaret fumbled with the key, her hands shaking slightly. I apologize if I overstepped, Mitch said finally, his voice low. Seemed the simplest solution at the time. Margaret turned to face him, finding her composure. Mr. Blackwood, there is nothing simple about marriage, convenient or otherwise. You've placed me in a very difficult position. You were already in a difficult position, he pointed out. I offered a way out. A way that binds me to a virtual stranger for life, Margaret countered. Not necessarily for life, Mitch said, surprising her. Arrangements can be made later if you wish. Annulment or divorce once you're established. Margaret was scandalized by the casual way he mentioned divorce. Is that how little marriage means to you? Something flashed in his eyes, anger or perhaps pain. I've buried everyone I ever cared about, Miss Holloway. I've learned not to make promises I can't keep. What I'm offering is protection and security, not false sentiments. His blunt words silenced her protests. There was a raw honesty in them that she couldn't dismiss. 1 week, she said finally. I'll give you my answer in 1 week, as I promised the council. Mitch nodded once. Fair enough. He turned to go, then paused. For what it's worth, I believe Jenkins would have been a good husband to you. He was a decent man. And you, Mr. Blackwood? Margaret asked before she could stop herself. Are you a decent man? His blue eyes met hers, unexpectedly vulnerable for an instant. I try to be, he said quietly, and then he was gone, striding down the darkened street toward where his horse was hitched. Margaret entered the store and locked the door behind her, leaning against it as the events of the evening washed over her. A marriage of convenience to Mitchell Blackwood. The very idea was absurd, and yet, she climbed the stairs to her small apartment, her mind churning with conflicting thoughts. Mitch was right about one thing: her position was precarious. Without legal standing or a male protector, her options in this frontier town were severely limited. The store offered her independence, but only if she could secure her claim to it. As she prepared for bed, Margaret tried to analyze Mitch's proposal objectively. A business arrangement, he had called it. No false sentiments, just protection and security in exchange for what? Fulfilling his obligation to a dead friend. Satisfying his sense of duty, Margaret blew out the lamp and lay in the darkness, wondering what kind of man proposed marriage so dispassionately. And why, despite all logic and propriety, she was actually considering accepting. The next 6 days passed in a blur of activity. Margaret threw herself into learning the business of the store, serving customers, organizing inventory, and studying the ledgers each night until her eyes burned. Mitch kept his distance, appearing only briefly each day to deliver supplies or check on her progress, never mentioning his proposal. On Sunday, Margaret attended church services, where she was formally introduced to the congregation by Reverend Davis. The townspeople were welcoming, if curious, and Margaret found herself surrounded by well-wishers after the service. "You've made quite an impression," Martha Wilson told her as they stood in the churchyard. "Half the town's been singing your praises for reopening the store so quickly." "That's gratifying to hear," Margaret replied, "though I'm still learning my way." Martha's gaze drifted to where Mitch stood talking with several ranchers at the edge of the gathering. "Have you given any thought to Mitchell's proposal? The whole town's talking about it, you know." Margaret sighed. "News travels quickly here. Small towns," Martha shrugged. "No secrets. For what it's worth, I think he's sincere in his offer. Mitchell Blackwood doesn't say things he doesn't mean. But marriage, Mrs. Wilson, to a man I barely know for the sake of convenience." Martha's expression softened. "Dear, most marriages out here begin as practical arrangements. Love, if it comes, follows later. My Henry and I were strangers when we wed. His medical practice needed a woman's touch, and my father was eager to see me settled. 30 years later, I can't imagine my life without him." "And if love doesn't follow?" Margaret asked quietly. "Then you have security, respect, and independence running the store," Martha replied pragmatically. "There are worse fates for a woman alone on the frontier." As the week progressed, Margaret found herself watching Mitch more closely during his brief visits. She noticed how the townspeople deferred to him, the respect in their greetings. She observed his interactions with children, gruff but kind, always taking time to listen to their chatter. She saw how he handled business transactions fair but firm, his word apparently considered as binding as any written contract. On Wednesday, a drifter caused trouble in the store, becoming belligerent when Margaret refused to extend him credit. Mitch arrived just as the situation was escalating, his mere presence enough to send the man backing toward the door with mumbled apologies. "You all right?" Mitch asked afterward, his eyes scanning her for any sign of harm. "Yes," Margaret replied, still shaken. "Thank you for your timely arrival." Mitch's jaw tightened. "Should have been here sooner. Man's got a reputation for trouble." "You can't always be here," Margaret pointed out. "Could if you were my wife," Mitch said simply, then turned and left before she could respond. On Friday, as Margaret was closing the store, Martha Wilson arrived with a basket. "Thought you might appreciate a home-cooked meal," she said, placing it on the counter. "And perhaps some company while you eat it." Margaret smiled gratefully. Both would be welcome. Upstairs, as they shared Martha's chicken and dumplings, the older woman broached the subject that had been hanging between them. "Tomorrow's your deadline with the council. Have you made your decision?" Margaret set down her fork. "I'm still uncertain, Mr. Blackwood's offer is practical, I understand that, but marriage should be more than a business arrangement." Martha studied her thoughtfully. "You know, Mitchell wasn't always as he is now. Before the war, before he lost his family, he was different. Henry knew him then, said he was quick to laugh, full of dreams for his ranch and the family he planned to raise there." "What happened to his family?" Margaret asked, curiosity overcoming her usual reserve. "Comanche raid 12 years ago," Martha replied softly. "Mitchell was away fighting in the war. His parents, his sister and her husband, their children all killed. Mitchell came home to nothing but graves and a burned-out homestead." Margaret's heart constricted at the thought. How terrible. "He rebuilt everything from scratch," Martha continued. The ranch is 10 times what it was before, but the man himself. She shook her head sadly. Some wounds never fully heal. After Martha left, Margaret sat alone by the window, watching the street below as Silver Creek settled into evening. She thought about Mitch and the losses he had endured, the walls he had built around himself. She thought about her own journey west, the courage it had taken to leave everything familiar behind. And she thought about Samuel Jenkins, the man she had never met but who had inadvertently brought her to this crossroads. What would he have wanted for her, for his store? For the friend who had tried to save his life, Saturday dawned clear and cool. Margaret opened the store as usual, but her mind was elsewhere as she served customers and made change. At noon, she closed briefly to eat a light meal, then reopened, watching the clock as the afternoon wore on. At 4 o'clock, she heard the now familiar sound of Mitch's boots on the wooden boardwalk outside. He entered the store, nodding to the customers browsing the shelves before approaching the counter. "Council meets at 7, he said quietly. "I'll come for you at 6:30. "Thank you," Margaret replied, their eyes meeting briefly before he turned and left. At 6:30 precisely, Margaret was waiting, dressed in the same blue dress she had worn to the previous council meeting. Mitch arrived on foot, his appearance once again transformed by clean clothes and careful grooming. They walked in silence to the hotel, the tension between them almost palpable. The council members were already seated when they arrived. Mayor Forbes called the meeting to order immediately. "Miss Holloway, we're gathered to hear your decision regarding Mitchell's proposal and your intentions toward Jenkins' store. The floor is yours." Margaret took a deep breath, feeling the weight of 5 pairs of eyes upon her. "Gentlemen, I've given this matter careful consideration. I believe Samuel Jenkins brought me here for a purpose, even if fate intervened before we could meet. This store serves an important function in your community, and I am committed to maintaining it." She paused, gathering her courage for what came next. "As for Mr. Blackwood's proposal, I accept." A murmur ran through the room. Mitch, sitting at the far end of the table, remained perfectly still, his expression revealing nothing. "However," Margaret continued, "I have conditions of my own to add to this arrangement." "Conditions?" Judge Parker's eyebrows rose. "This is hardly a standard negotiation, Miss Holloway. Nevertheless, if I am to enter into a marriage of convenience, I believe I am entitled to clarify the terms," Margaret replied firmly. Mayor Forbes cleared his throat. "What are these conditions?" "First, the store remains under my management, with all decisions regarding its operation mine alone." Margaret looked directly at Mitch as she spoke. "Second, I wish to use a portion of the living quarters above the store as a schoolroom 3 afternoons each week to provide education for the children of Silver Creek." "Those seem reasonable requests," Reverend Davis nodded approvingly. "Third," Margaret continued, her heart pounding, "this arrangement will be presented to the town as a genuine marriage, not a matter of convenience. I won't have people pitying me or questioning my position." This condition brought a moment of silence. Mitch leaned forward slightly, his intense gaze fixed on her face. "And finally," Margaret said, meeting his eyes directly, "I request a real chance at making this a true marriage, not merely an arrangement of convenience. I didn't travel 2,000 miles to live half a life, Mr. Blackwood. If we are to do this, I want us both to enter into it with the possibility, however remote, that it might become more than a business transaction." The room fell completely silent. Mitch's expression changed, subtly surprise, perhaps, or something deeper that Margaret couldn't name. "Those are my terms," she finished quietly. "I await Mr. Blackwood's response." All eyes turned to Mitch, who stood slowly, his gaze never leaving Margaret's face. "I accept your conditions," he said, his deep voice resonating in the quiet room. "All of them." Mayor Forbes cleared his throat again, clearly flustered by the unexpected turn of events. "Well then, that's settled. Reverend Davis, when could you perform the ceremony?" "Tomorrow after services would be appropriate," the Reverend replied, "if that suits the couple." "It does," Mitch answered before Margaret could speak. "Unless Miss Holloway requires more time, tomorrow is acceptable," Margaret said, her voice steadier than she felt. The meeting concluded shortly after. with Judge Parker promising to draw up the necessary papers transferring the store to Margaret's name upon her marriage to Mitch. As they left the hotel, Margaret was acutely aware of Mitch walking beside her, his presence somehow both reassuring and unsettling. They had reached the store before either spoke. "Did you mean it?" Mitch asked finally, his voice low. About wanting a real chance, Margaret looked up at him, finding unexpected vulnerability in his blue eyes. "I did. I may be practical, Mr. Blackwood, but I'm not willing to resign myself to a loveless arrangement for the rest of my life, not without trying for something more." Mitch studied her face in the fading light. "I can't promise you'll find what you're looking for with me, Margaret. I'm not the man I was before the war." It was the first time he had used her given name, and the sound of it in his deep voice sent an unexpected shiver through her. "I'm not asking for promises," she replied softly, "just possibility." After a long moment, Mitch nodded. "Fair enough." He hesitated, then added, "I'll come for you at 9 tomorrow, for the wedding." "I'll be ready," Margaret said, suddenly overwhelmed by the reality of what they had agreed to. Mitch turned to go, then stopped. In a gesture that startled her with its gentleness, he reached out and briefly touched her cheek. "Good night, Margaret," he said quietly, and then he was gone, disappearing into the gathering darkness. Margaret entered the store and climbed the stairs to her apartment, her mind whirling with the enormity of what she had just committed to. Tomorrow, she would become Mrs. Mitchell Blackwood, wife to a man she barely knew, in a marriage that might or might not ever be real. As she prepared for bed, Margaret found herself wondering about the ranch Mitch had rebuilt, the home where he lived alone with his memories and regrets. Tomorrow, she would pledge herself to this complex, wounded man, binding her future to his. The thought was terrifying and yet somehow exhilarating. Sunday morning dawned bright and clear, a perfect September day in the Wyoming territory. Margaret woke early, too nervous to sleep, and spent the morning preparing. She bathed carefully, washing her long chestnut hair and pinning it in an elegant style that had been fashionable in Boston. From her trunk, she removed the one truly fine dress she had brought west, a cream-colored silk with delicate lace trim that had been her mother's. As she dressed, Margaret's thoughts turned to her parents. What would they think of her marrying a stranger, a hardened frontiersman so different from the genteel suitors they had once hoped for? Her father, practical as he was, might have understood the necessity. Her mother would have worried for her happiness, but both would have wanted her to seize whatever chance she had for a secure future and perhaps even love. At precisely 9 o'clock, there was a knock at the store door. Margaret descended the stairs, her heart pounding, and opened it to find Mitch standing there, looking more formal than she had yet seen him. He wore a dark suit that, while not new, was well made and fitted his powerful frame impressively. His dark hair was neatly combed, his face freshly shaved. For a moment, he simply stared at her, something like wonder crossing his usually guarded features. "You look beautiful," he said finally, the words seeming to surprise even him. Margaret felt a flush rise to her cheeks. "Thank you. You look quite handsome yourself." Mitch offered his arm, and Margaret took it, feeling the solid strength beneath the fabric of his suit. They walked to the church in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. As they approached, Margaret could see that a crowd had gathered. Apparently, the whole town had turned out for the unexpected wedding. "Are you ready for this?" Mitch asked quietly as they paused at the church steps. Margaret looked up at him, finding unexpected reassurance in his steady blue gaze. "Yes," she replied, and was surprised to discover she meant it. The ceremony itself was brief but dignified. Reverend Davis spoke of commitment and partnership, carefully avoiding the more traditional emphasis on romantic love. Martha Wilson stood as Margaret's witness, while Doc Wilson stood for Mitch. When the time came to exchange vows, Margaret was startled by the firmness in Mitch's voice as he repeated the sacred promises. "I, Mitchell James Blackwood, take thee, Margaret Elizabeth Holloway, to be my wedded wife." And when it was her turn, Margaret found her own voice growing stronger with each word, her commitment solidifying as she spoke it aloud. When Reverend Davis pronounced them husband and wife, there was a moment of awkward hesitation before Mitch leaned down and placed a brief, gentle kiss on Margaret's lips, their first physical contact, beyond the casual touch of hands or arms. The kiss was over almost before it began, but Margaret felt a surprising warmth spread through her at the contact. The townsfolk surrounded them afterward, offering congratulations and well wishes. The Wilson daughters had prepared a small reception in the church hall, with cake and punch for all to share. Margaret found herself swept up in conversations with her new neighbors, many of whom she knew only as customers from the store. Mitch remained at her side throughout, his hand occasionally coming to rest lightly at the small of her back, a gesture that seemed both protective and possessive. Margaret noticed how differently the townsfolk treated her now, with a new respect in their addresses. No longer Miss Holloway, the stranded bride, but Mrs. Blackwood, wife of one of the most respected men in the county. As the reception wound down, Martha approached them, her expression warm but concerned. "I've had your things packed and sent to the ranch," she told Margaret quietly. "Hope you don't mind my presumption, but I thought you'd want to settle in properly." Margaret's heart skipped a beat at the reminder that she would be leaving the store apartment, the only home she had known in Silver Creek, for Mitch's ranch. "Thank you," she managed. "That was thoughtful." "The store will be fine for a few days," Martha continued. "My Beatrice has offered to open it tomorrow and Tuesday to give you time to adjust to your new circumstances." Mitch nodded his thanks. "Appreciate that, Martha." As the last guests departed, Mitch turned to Margaret. "Ready to see your new home?" Margaret took a deep breath. "Yes, I believe I am." Outside, a wagon waited instead of Mitch's usual mount. He helped her up to the seat, then climbed up beside her and took the reins. As they drove out of town, Margaret watched Silver Creek recede behind them, the church steeple standing tall against the vast Wyoming sky. "It's about 5 miles to the ranch," Mitch said as they followed a well-worn road that led west from town. "Not a long ride, but enough distance to give some privacy." Margaret nodded, unsure what to say. The reality of what she had done was finally setting in. She had married this man, this virtual stranger, and was now heading to his home to begin a life together that neither of them had planned. "I should tell you about the ranch," Mitch continued, filling the silence. "Main house is 2 stories. Built it myself after the old one burned. There's a foreman, Jim Cooper, and his wife Ellie, who does the cooking and housekeeping. 6 ranch hands who live in the bunkhouse. Good men, loyal." "It sounds substantial," Margaret said, trying to picture it. "Started with nothing after the war," Mitch said, his voice taking on a hint of pride. "Built it acre by acre, head by head." They crested a small rise, and suddenly the Circle B spread out before them, a sprawling ranch nestled in a verdant valley, with mountains rising in the distance. The main house was larger than Margaret had imagined, a handsome 2-story structure with a wide front porch. Outbuildings dotted the property, a barn, stables, bunkhouse, and what appeared to be a small schoolhouse. "It's beautiful," Margaret said sincerely, awed by the scale and beauty of her new home. A hint of a smile touched Mitch's lips. "Wait till you see it in spring, when the wildflowers carpet the foothills." As they approached the house, a middle-aged couple emerged onto the porch, the foreman and his wife, Margaret presumed. Mitch reined in the horses in front of the steps and jumped down, coming around to help Margaret descend. "Jim, Ellie," Mitch called out. "This is Margaret, my wife." The words sounded strange to Margaret's ears, formal and yet intimate. She wondered if they sounded equally foreign to Mitch. Ellie Cooper came forward with a warm smile. "Welcome to the Circle B, Mrs. Blackwood. We're so pleased to have you here." "Thank you," Margaret replied, returning the smile. "I hope I won't disrupt your routines too much." "Nonsense," Ellie said firmly. "This house has needed a mistress for far too long." She shot a meaningful glance at Mitch, who looked away uncomfortably. "I've prepared the master bedroom and heated water for a bath, if you'd like to freshen up after your journey." Margaret glanced at Mitch, suddenly uncertain. They hadn't discussed sleeping arrangements or any of the intimate details that normal couples would have settled before marriage. "Show her the house, Ellie," Mitch said, seemingly understanding her discomfort. "I need to check on a new foal with Jim." As the men headed toward the barn, Ellie led Margaret into the house. The interior was surprisingly refined for a bachelor rancher's home, the furnishings solid and well-made, the rooms spacious and airy. A large stone fireplace dominated the main sitting room, with comfortable chairs arranged before it. Mitch built most of the furniture himself, Ellie explained as she showed Margaret through the downstairs rooms. He's got a talent for woodworking. Does it during the winter months when ranch work slows. The kitchen was large and well-equipped, with a massive cast iron stove and ample work surfaces. A dining room adjoined it, centered around a table that could easily seat 12. Does Mitch entertain often? Margaret asked, gesturing to the large table. Ellie shook her head. Hardly ever. But his parents used to host the whole community for holidays. I think he built it with memories in mind, not current needs. Upstairs, Ellie showed Margaret to the master bedroom, a spacious room with large windows overlooking the valley. A massive 4-poster bed dominated the space, its quilt a handsome pattern of blues and greens. Margaret's trunks had already been delivered and stood waiting at the foot of the bed. The bathing room is through there, Ellie indicated a door in the corner. Mitch had it built just last year, piped water from the well and a drain that runs out back, quite modern. It's all lovely, Margaret said, genuinely impressed by the thought and care that had gone into the house. Not at all what I expected, Ellie's expression softened. Mitch isn't what most people expect when they take the time to look past the surface. She patted Margaret's arm gently. I'll leave you to rest and freshen up. Dinner will be at 6. After Ellie departed, Margaret explored the bedroom more thoroughly. A dressing table with a mirror stood near the window, and a tall wardrobe occupied one wall. On the nightstand beside the bed, she noticed a framed daguerreotype of a young couple, Mitch's parents, perhaps. The bathing room was indeed impressively modern for a ranch home, with a large copper tub and an ingenious system of pipes that brought hot water from a reservoir beside the kitchen stove. Margaret gratefully sank into the bath Ellie had prepared, allowing the warm water to soothe her tense muscles and calm her racing thoughts. Afterward, she unpacked one of her trunks, hanging her modest collection of dresses in the spacious wardrobe. The contrast between her simple belongings and the solid grandeur of the house made her feel suddenly inadequate. What did she know about being the mistress of such an establishment, about being a rancher's wife? At 6 o'clock, after changing into a fresh dress, Margaret descended to the dining room. Mitch was already there, standing by the fireplace, now dressed in more casual attire, a clean shirt and trousers, but without the formality of his wedding suit. Ellie's an excellent cook, he said by way of greeting. One of the reasons I've kept her and Jim on for 10 years. The house is beautiful, Margaret replied. You've created something remarkable here. A flicker of pride crossed Mitch's face. Built it to last, for... He hesitated, then finished quietly, for the future. Ellie served a dinner that exceeded Margaret's expectations: roast beef with potatoes and carrots, fresh bread, and an apple pie for dessert. The conversation during the meal was stilted at first, both Margaret and Mitch navigating the strange new reality of dining together as husband and wife. Gradually, however, Margaret began asking questions about the ranch operations, and Mitch responded with increasing animation. He explained the breeding program he had developed for his cattle, the irrigation system he had designed for the hay fields, and his plans for expanding the herd in the coming year. "You're quite the businessman," Margaret observed as Ellie cleared away the dessert plates. "The store's ledgers could benefit from your expertise. Different scale, same principles," Mitch replied with a shrug. "Careful planning, reinvestment of profits, building for the long term." After dinner, they moved to the sitting room where a fire had been laid to ward off the evening chill. Margaret took a seat in one of the comfortable chairs, while Mitch remained standing, his tall frame silhouetted against the flames. "I should address the sleeping arrangements," he said abruptly, his back to her. "The master bedroom is yours. I'll continue to use the room at the end of the hall where I've been sleeping." Margaret was both relieved and oddly disappointed by his declaration. "That's very considerate, but it's best this way for now," Mitch interrupted, turning to face her. "You wanted a chance at a real marriage. That takes time, trust, getting to know one another." "Yes, of course," Margaret agreed, though part of her had expected or perhaps feared that he would immediately claim his husbandly rights. "I meant what I said about accepting your conditions," Mitch continued, his expression earnest in the firelight. All of them, including the last one. Margaret's heart beat faster at the intensity in his gaze. I appreciate that. Mitch moved to sit in the chair opposite hers, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. There's something you should know, Margaret, something I should have told you before you agreed to this marriage. Margaret tensed, her mind racing with possibilities. What is it? I knew Samuel was dead before you arrived, Mitch admitted, his voice low. News came on the telegraph 2 days before your train was due. I rode to meet you at the station because I felt responsible for bringing you here under false pretenses. Margaret stared at him, processing this revelation. But the station master seemed surprised when I mentioned Samuel's name. Tom's a good man, but a terrible actor, Mitch said with a hint of a smile. I asked him to let me handle it, but he couldn't keep up the pretense. So you came to the station intending to tell me Samuel had died, Margaret said slowly. But instead you offered me his store and his home. Mitch nodded. You looked so alone standing there, so brave despite everything. I couldn't just leave you stranded. Why are you telling me this now? Margaret asked, confused by his timing. Because I want there to be truth between us, Mitch replied simply. If we're to have any chance at building something real, it has to start with honesty. Margaret was touched by his sincerity. Thank you for telling me, and for meeting me that day. I don't know what would have become of me otherwise. You'd have found your way, Mitch said with unexpected conviction. You're stronger than you realize, Margaret Blackwood. The sound of her new name sent a curious warmth through Margaret's chest. They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the fire burn lower in the grate. Finally, Mitch stood. It's been a long day, you should rest. Margaret rose as well, suddenly awkward again. Yes, I suppose I should. They climbed the stairs together, stopping at the door to the master bedroom. Good night, Margaret, Mitch said softly. Good night, Mitch, she replied, using his shortened name for the first time. He smiled a real smile that transformed his stern features and lit his blue eyes with warmth. Then, with a slight bow of his head, he continued down the hall to his own room. Margaret entered the bedroom and closed the door, leaning against it for a moment as she collected her thoughts. This morning, she had been Margaret Holloway, a stranded bride with uncertain prospects. Tonight, she was Margaret Blackwood, mistress of the Circle B Ranch, wife to one of the most respected men in the county. It was not the life she had envisioned when she boarded the train in Boston. But as she prepared for bed in the comfortable room that was now hers, Margaret found herself thinking that perhaps it might, in time, become a life she could embrace with her whole heart. The next few weeks established a routine of sorts. Margaret spent her mornings learning the workings of the ranch household from Ellie, who proved to be not only an excellent cook, but also a patient teacher. In the afternoons, Mitch would often take her riding across the vast property, showing her the boundaries of the Circle B and explaining the seasonal cycles of ranch work. Margaret had never ridden before coming west, but Mitch was a surprisingly good instructor, firm but patient, praising her progress and steadying her when she faltered. He selected a gentle mare named Daisy for her, and Margaret quickly grew to love their afternoon rides, both for the magnificent scenery and for the gradual relaxation of Mitch's usual reserve as they rode side by side. 3 days a week, Margaret returned to town to run the store, which was thriving under her organized management. She implemented several improvements, including a clearer inventory system and a small reading corner with a few books for children to enjoy while their parents shopped. True to her word, she also established a small school in the living quarters above the store, offering lessons to the children of Silver Creek 3 afternoons each week. The response was enthusiastic, with 20 children attending regularly, their ages ranging from 6 to 16. You're a natural teacher, Mitch observed one afternoon as he picked her up from the store after lessons had concluded. Those children adore you, Margaret smiled, pleased by his approval. Teaching has always been my passion. I'm grateful I can continue it here. The town's grateful too, Mitch replied. Doc Wilson says his daughters haven't stopped talking about how much better organized the store is and how the children are actually learning something useful now. At the ranch, evenings fell into a comfortable pattern. After dinner, they would sit in the parlor, sometimes talking, sometimes reading companionably. Mitch, Margaret discovered, was surprisingly well-read for a rancher, with a small but quality collection of books that he had accumulated over the years. "My mother was a schoolteacher before she married my father," he explained when Margaret commented on his library. "She believed education was the most valuable thing she could give us, out here where formal schooling was scarce." "Us," Margaret inquired. "You had siblings?" A shadow crossed Mitch's face. "A sister, Rebecca, 4 years younger than me." Margaret remembered what Martha had told her about the Comanche raid that had claimed Mitch's family. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I shouldn't have pried." "No," Mitch shook his head. "You have a right to know about my past. Rebecca was. She was like sunshine, always laughing, always seeing the good in everything. She married young a homesteader named David. They had twin boys." His voice caught slightly, and Margaret instinctively reached out, placing her hand over his. "You don't have to continue." "I do," Mitch insisted quietly. "They all died while I was away fighting a war that seemed important at the time. I wasn't here to protect them when the raid came." The pain in his voice was raw, even after all these years. Margaret's heart ached for the young man who had returned from war to find his entire family gone, his home destroyed. "You rebuilt everything," she said, her hand still covering his. "That takes incredible strength, or stubbornness," Mitch replied with a hint of his dry humor. "Some days, I'm not sure which." Their physical relationship remained respectful and distant, limited to the occasional brush of hands or the brief touch of Mitch's palm at the small of Margaret's back when they walked together. They continued to sleep in separate bedrooms, though Margaret sometimes found herself lying awake, wondering if Mitch was also awake down the hall, thinking of her as she thought of him. October passed into November, bringing cooler temperatures and the first dusting of snow on the distant mountains. The ranch grew busier as preparations for winter intensified, hay being stored, cattle moved to lower pastures, buildings reinforced against the coming storms. Margaret found herself increasingly involved in ranch operations, keeping accounts and ordering supplies, skills that transferred naturally from her work at the store. The ranch hands, initially skeptical of their boss's city-bred wife, gradually accepted her as they recognized her intelligence and willingness to learn. One evening in mid-November, as they sat before the fire after dinner, Mitch cleared his throat nervously. "There's a harvest dance in town this Saturday. Thought you might like to go." Margaret looked up from her mending in surprise. "A dance? Town tradition," Mitch explained. "Last celebration before winter sets in properly. Usually a good time. You dance." Margaret asked, unable to keep the astonishment from her voice. A ghost of a smile touched Mitch's lips. "Been known to on occasion. My mother insisted I learn." The image of Mitch dancing was so unexpected that Margaret couldn't help but smile. "Then yes, I'd like to go very much." Saturday arrived clear and cold. Margaret spent extra time on her appearance, selecting her best dress, a deep burgundy wool that brought out the rich tones in her chestnut hair. She arranged her hair more elaborately than usual, securing it with her mother's pearl combs. When she descended the stairs, she found Mitch waiting in the foyer, wearing his good suit and looking uncharacteristically nervous. He stared at her for a long moment before speaking. "You look beautiful," he said simply. "Thank you," Margaret replied, a blush warming her cheeks. "You look very handsome yourself." The ride to town was filled with a new tension anticipation rather than awkwardness. Margaret found herself stealing glances at Mitch's profile, admiring the strong line of his jaw and the way the fading sunlight caught in his dark hair. The town hall was transformed for the harvest dance, decorated with autumn leaves and lit by dozens of lanterns. A small band played in one corner, and tables laden with food and drink lined the walls. It seemed the entire population of Silver Creek and the surrounding homesteads had turned out for the occasion. Their entrance caused a momentary lull in the conversation, heads turning to observe the rancher and his new bride. Margaret felt a flutter of nervousness, but Mitch's hand at her elbow was steady and reassuring. Martha Wilson bustled over immediately, her face alight with pleasure. "Margaret, Mitchell, so glad you could come." "Margaret, you must meet everyone properly. There are so many folks from the outlying areas who haven't had the chance to make your acquaintance yet. For the next hour, Margaret found herself introduced to what seemed like everyone within 20 miles: farmers, ranchers, tradespeople, and their families. She was touched by how many mentioned their appreciation for the reopened store or their children's enthusiasm for her lessons. "You've made quite an impression in a short time," Mitch observed as they finally found a moment alone, sipping punch by one of the tables. "People have been very welcoming," Margaret replied. "More than I expected, given the unusual circumstances of our marriage." "They judge by what they see," Mitch said. "And what they see is a woman who stepped up to fill a need in the community without complaint. That counts for a lot out here." The band struck up a lively tune, and couples began to fill the dance floor. Mitch set down his punch cup and turned to Margaret with an unexpectedly boyish smile. "May I have this dance, Mrs. Blackwood?" Margaret placed her hand in his outstretched one, her heart beating faster at the warmth of his touch. "You may, Mr. Blackwood." To her surprise, Mitch proved to be an excellent dancer, leading her through the steps with confident ease. His large hand at her waist was gentle but firm, guiding her turns and steps with skill that belied his usual taciturn demeanor. "Your mother taught you well," Margaret commented as they circled the floor. "She believed a gentleman should know how to dance properly," Mitch replied, a fond sadness in his voice at the memory. "Made my father practice with me when she thought I wasn't getting the steps right." The image of a young Mitch dancing with his father under his mother's critical eye made Margaret smile. "She sounds like a remarkable woman." "She was," Mitch agreed. "You remind me of her sometimes, your determination, your insistence on doing things properly." Margaret was touched by the comparison. "I would have liked to know her. She would have liked you," Mitch said with certainty. "Very much." They danced several more times as the evening progressed, gradually relaxing in each other's arms. During a particularly lively reel, Margaret caught a glimpse of Martha Wilson watching them with a satisfied smile. As the night wore on, the band shifted to slower, more romantic tunes. Mitch hesitated as the opening notes of a waltz filled the hall, looking down at Margaret questioningly. "We don't have to," he said softly. "If you're tired." "I'm not tired," Margaret replied, holding his gaze steadily. Mitch drew her closer then, one hand at her waist, the other clasping hers as they began to move in the flowing three-quarter time of the waltz. Margaret was acutely aware of his nearness, of the solid strength of his chest beneath her hand, of the scent of soap and leather that she had come to associate with him. They moved together with surprising harmony, as if they had danced this way 100 times before. Margaret found herself relaxing into his embrace, allowing herself to be guided completely by his lead. "We fit well together," Mitch murmured, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Yes," Margaret agreed, her heart pounding at the double meaning that might lie beneath his words. "We do." When the dance ended, Mitch didn't immediately release her, his blue eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. For a moment, Margaret thought he might kiss her, right there in the middle of the dance floor. Instead, he stepped back, offering her his arm. "Would you like some air? It's getting warm in here." Margaret nodded, allowing him to lead her through the crowd and out onto the porch that wrapped around the town hall. The night was clear and cold, stars glittering like diamonds in the black velvet sky. Their breath formed small clouds in the chilly air. "Are you cold?" Mitch asked, already shrugging out of his suit jacket. "A little," Margaret admitted, gratefully accepting the jacket as he draped it around her shoulders. It was warm from his body and smelled of him, a scent she had unconsciously come to find comforting. They stood side by side at the porch railing, looking out at the quiet town. The music from inside created a muted backdrop to the peaceful night. "I never thanked you properly," Margaret said after a comfortable silence. "For what?" Mitch asked, glancing down at her. "For everything. For meeting me at the station that day, for offering me the store, for—" She hesitated, then finished softly, "For marrying me when you had no obligation to do so." Mitch turned to face her fully, his expression serious in the dim light spilling from the windows. "I had every obligation," he said quietly, "not just to Jenkins, but to myself, to the man I want to be." "And what man is that?" Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. A man of honor, Mitch replied. A man who keeps his word. He paused, then added more softly, a man worthy of someone like you. Margaret's heart seemed to stop, then restart at a faster pace. Mitch. Before she could continue, he reached out, gently touching her cheek with calloused fingers that were surprisingly tender. I know this isn't what you came west for, Margaret. I know I'm not the man you expected to marry. But I want you to know that I'm grateful, every day, that you were willing to take a chance on me. The vulnerability in his voice, so unlike his usual self-contained manner, moved Margaret deeply. Without thinking, she raised her hand to cover his where it rested against her cheek. I'm the one who should be grateful, she said. You gave me a home when I had none, a purpose when I was lost. Mitch's gaze dropped to her lips, and this time Margaret knew with certainty that he was going to kiss her. She tilted her face up to his, her heart pounding with anticipation. His lips met hers gently at first, a questioning touch that asked permission rather than demanded it. When she responded, leaning into him slightly, his arms came around her, drawing her closer as the kiss deepened. It was nothing like the brief, ceremonial kiss they had shared at their wedding. This was a real kiss, warm and alive with possibilities, awakening feelings in Margaret that she had never experienced before. Her hands found their way to Mitch's shoulders, steadying herself as the world seemed to tilt around her. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing faster. Mitch rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed as if savoring the moment. I've wanted to do that for weeks, he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. Why didn't you? Margaret asked softly. Mitch opened his eyes, meeting her gaze with naked honesty. Because I was afraid once I started, I wouldn't want to stop. The heat in his words sent a tremor through Margaret. And now, a smile touched his lips, a real smile that transformed his face and made him look years younger. Now I'm even more afraid of that. But I'm no longer afraid of wanting it. The sound of the door opening behind them broke the moment. A couple emerged, laughing as they sought their own private spot on the porch. Mitch stepped back slightly, though he kept Margaret's hand in his. Perhaps we should return inside, Margaret suggested, aware of the warmth in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the temperature. Or perhaps, Mitch countered, his voice low, we should go home. The word home spoken with such certainty, as if there could be no doubt that the Circle B was now home to both of them, filled Margaret with unexpected joy. Yes, she agreed, her heart light with new possibilities. Let's go home. The ride back to the ranch was charged with a new awareness between them. They spoke little, but the silence was comfortable, filled with shared glances and the occasional touch of hands as Mitch helped Margaret into and out of the wagon. At the ranch, the house was quiet, the lamps left burning low in the hallway by the thoughtful Ellie. Mitch hung their coats by the door, then turned to Margaret, suddenly uncertain again. I meant what I said about taking things slowly, he said, his voice low. Nothing needs to change tonight, if you're not ready. Margaret studied his face in the soft lamplight, the strong lines softened by vulnerability, the blue eyes watching her with a mixture of desire and restraint. In that moment, she recognized the truth that had been growing in her heart over the past weeks. I think, she said carefully, that some changes might be welcome. Mitch's breath caught audibly. Margaret, she stepped closer to him, summoning a courage she hadn't known she possessed. I came west seeking a new life, Mitch, a real life with all that entails. I believe I've found it here with you. The restraint in his expression gave way to wonder, and then to a joy that transformed his features. Are you sure? In answer, Margaret rose on tiptoe and pressed her lips to his, initiating a kiss for the first time. Mitch responded instantly, his arms coming around her, lifting her slightly as he deepened the kiss with a passion that had been held in check for too long. When they broke apart, both breathing heavily, Mitch rested his forehead against hers. I never thought I'd feel this way again, he admitted roughly. After losing everything, I closed that part of myself off, didn't think I deserved it, didn't think I could survive losing it again. And now? Margaret asked, her heart pounding. Now I'm terrified, he confessed with a small, self-deprecating laugh. But I'm more terrified of not taking the chance, of not discovering what we could be together. Margaret touched his face gently, tracing the strong line of his jaw. Then let's discover it together, day by day. Mitch nodded, his eyes never leaving hers as he took her hand and led her up the stairs. At the door to the master bedroom, he paused, giving her one last chance to change her mind. Margaret answered his unspoken question by reaching up to kiss him again, her decision made with both her heart and mind. As Mitch lifted her into his arms and carried her across the threshold, Margaret knew with absolute certainty that the shivering bride who had waited at the station had found not just shelter, but a love worth crossing a continent for. Winter settled over the Wyoming territory with uncompromising intensity. Snow blanketed the ranch in pristine white, transforming the landscape into a stark but beautiful tableau. The work of the ranch continued despite the weather, cattle to be fed, buildings to be maintained, preparations for spring calving to be made. For Margaret and Mitch, the winter months brought a deepening of their relationship. The physical intimacy they now shared was matched by an emotional closeness that grew with each passing day. They learned each other's habits and preferences, the small compromises and adjustments that transformed two individuals into a couple. Margaret discovered that Mitch was an early riser, often slipping from their bed before dawn to check on the ranch operations. He would return to find coffee waiting and breakfast nearly ready, Margaret having adapted her schedule to complement his. They would share the meal together, discussing the day ahead before Mitch headed out to work, and Margaret turned to her own tasks, keeping the ranch accounts, planning improvements to the house, or preparing for her teaching days in town. On the days Margaret taught at the store, Mitch would escort her to town himself, unwilling to trust her safety to anyone else during the harsh winter weather. He would work in town on those days, meeting with suppliers or the banker, and return to collect her when her lessons were finished. "The children are making remarkable progress," Margaret told him one snowy afternoon as they drove back to the ranch. "Even Tommy Jenkins, who could barely read in September, finished an entire chapter book this week." "They're lucky to have you," Mitch replied, his voice warm with pride. "This territory needs more education if it's ever going to prosper properly." "I've been thinking," Margaret said hesitantly, "about expanding the school, perhaps even building a proper schoolhouse eventually." Mitch glanced at her with interest. "You want to teach full-time?" "Not immediately," Margaret clarified. "The store needs attention too. But in time, yes, I think I would. If the town continues to grow, the need will only increase." Mitch was quiet for a moment, considering. "There's that parcel of land at the edge of town, near the creek. Would make a good location for a schoolhouse, centrally located for the town children and the homesteaders' kids." Margaret's heart swelled at his immediate support. "You think the town council would approve such a project?" A rare grin crossed Mitch's face. "Well, seeing as how I'm on the council and the mayor listens to whatever Doc Wilson says, and Doc Wilson does whatever Martha tells him to, I'd say your chances are good." Margaret laughed, reaching over to squeeze his arm through his heavy coat. "You're a devious man, Mitchell Blackwood." "Only for a good cause," he replied, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "And only for you." As winter progressed, Margaret found herself experiencing a contentment she had never known before. The hard work of ranch life suited her practical nature, and the challenges of adapting to frontier living engaged her intellect. But it was the growing bond with Mitch that brought her the deepest satisfaction. He was not a man given to flowery declarations or excessive demonstrations of affection in public. But in private, Margaret discovered a tenderness in him that belied his rugged exterior. He would bring her wildflowers he found on his rides, preserved beneath the snow. He carved a beautiful box for her sewing supplies during the long winter evenings. And at night, in the privacy of their bedroom, he showed her with actions rather than words the depth of his feelings for her. Christmas approached, bringing with it traditions both old and new. Margaret decorated the house with pine boughs and red ribbons, filling the rooms with the scent of the forest. Ellie taught her to make the special cookies that had been a Blackwood family tradition for generations. "Mitch's mother made these every Christmas," Ellie explained as they cut star shapes from the spiced dough. "The first few years after he came back from the war, he wouldn't allow any Christmas celebrations at all. Too painful, I think. but gradually he started allowing small things back in. These cookies were the first tradition he asked for again. Margaret absorbed this information thoughtfully. What about his parents' Christmas decorations? Were any saved from the fire? Ellie hesitated. There's a trunk in the attic. Some things his mother kept special ornaments from their home back east, the family Bible, a few other keepsakes. They were stored in the root cellar when the raid came, so they survived, but Mitch has never opened that trunk, not in all these years. That night after dinner, Margaret broached the subject carefully. Ellie mentioned there might be some family Christmas decorations in the attic. Mitch stiffened almost imperceptibly before forcing himself to relax. There's a trunk, he acknowledged. Some things of my mother's. Would you mind if I looked through it? Margaret asked gently. Only if you're comfortable with the idea, of course. Mitch was silent for a long moment, staring into the fire. Haven't opened it since I put it up there 12 years ago, he admitted finally. Wasn't ready to face those memories. And now, Margaret prompted softly. He turned to look at her, his blue eyes reflecting both pain and resolve. Now I have new memories to balance the old ones. Maybe it's time. The next morning, Mitch led Margaret to the attic where a large cedar trunk stood in one corner, covered with a sheet. He removed the sheet, revealing the trunk's beautifully carved lid, inlaid with a pattern of leaves and flowers. My father made this as a wedding gift for my mother, Mitch explained, running his hand almost reverently over the smooth wood. She kept all her special things in it. He produced a small key from his pocket and handed it to Margaret. You open it, he said quietly. I'm not sure I can. Margaret accepted the key, understanding the trust he was placing in her. She unlocked the trunk and lifted the lid carefully, revealing neatly packed contents protected by layers of muslin. The first layer contained the family Bible, its leather binding worn but well preserved. Margaret lifted it out gently, opening it to find generations of Blackwoods recorded on the family page's births, marriages, deaths, all the way back to Mitch's great-grandparents in Virginia. Your full name is Mitchell James Blackwood, she observed, tracing the entry of his birth with her finger. Born May 12, 1841. Named for both grandfathers, Mitch confirmed, looking over her shoulder at the Bible, his expression softening at the sight of his mother's careful handwriting. Beneath the Bible lay carefully wrapped ornaments, delicate glass balls, and carved wooden figures that had decorated Blackwood Christmas trees for decades. Each one had a story, which Mitch shared in a voice that grew steadier as he reconnected with the happy memories of his childhood. This angel was always placed at the top of the tree, he explained, holding a porcelain figure with carefully painted features. My father would lift Rebecca up to place it, every Christmas Eve. At the bottom of the trunk, wrapped in a piece of silk, Margaret found a beautiful silver locket. Inside were miniature portraits of a handsome couple in their prime. Mitch's parents, she realized. I'd forgotten about that, Mitch said, his voice thick with emotion. My father gave it to my mother on their 20th anniversary. She wore it every day. Margaret closed it carefully and held it out to him. It's beautiful, she must have treasured it. Mitch stared at the locket for a long moment, then gently closed Margaret's fingers around it. She would want you to have it, he said softly, as the new mistress of the house she loved. Tears sprang to Margaret's eyes at the significance of the gesture. Mitch, I couldn't possibly, please, he interrupted, his eyes holding hers intently. It would mean a great deal to me, Margaret nodded, too moved to speak. Mitch helped her fasten the locket around her neck, his fingers lingering on the delicate silver chain. It belongs there, he said with satisfaction, just as you belong here. That Christmas was one of new beginnings for the Circle B. The house was decorated with the ornaments from the trunk, blended with the pine boughs and ribbons Margaret had prepared. The ranch hands were invited to Christmas dinner, filling the dining room with laughter and conversation that had been absent for too many years. As she watched Mitch carve the turkey at the head of the table, his face relaxed and genuinely happy, Margaret felt a surge of gratitude for the strange twist of fate that had brought her to this place, to this man. The shivering bride who had waited at the train station had found not just a home, but a true partnership that grew stronger with each passing day. Spring arrived with explosive beauty. the Wyoming landscape bursting into bloom almost overnight as temperatures warmed. Margaret was astonished by the transformation: rolling hills carpeted with wildflowers, meadows lush with new grass, trees budding with tender green leaves. "You were right," she told Mitch as they rode across the property one perfect April morning. "It's even more beautiful in spring." Mitch smiled, his face more relaxed and open than it had been when she first met him. The winter had been good for them both, a time of growing closer, of building a foundation for their future together. "Wait till you see the foals," he replied, guiding his horse toward one of the outlying pastures. "First ones should have been born last night or this morning." The sight of the newborn foals, spindly-legged and curious, delighted Margaret. She watched in awe as they nursed from their mothers, then took their first experimental gallops around the pasture. "They're magnificent," she breathed, leaning against the fence beside Mitch. "So perfect and so brave all at once." Mitch's arm came around her shoulders, drawing her against his side. "Like someone else I know," he said softly, pressing a kiss to her temple. Margaret turned in his embrace, tilting her face up to his. "I have news," she said, her heart pounding with both nervousness and joy. "News I've been waiting to be certain of before I told you." Mitch's expression grew concerned at her serious tone. "What is it?" Margaret took a deep breath, then said simply, "We're going to have a child, in late October, according to Doc Wilson." For a moment, Mitch stood perfectly still, his face a study in stunned disbelief. Then, with a whoop of joy that startled the horses in the nearby pasture, he lifted Margaret off her feet, spinning her in a circle before setting her carefully back on the ground. "A baby," he said, his voice filled with wonder. "Our baby." "You're pleased then?" Margaret asked, though his reaction had already answered her question. "Please doesn't begin to cover it," Mitch replied, his hands cradling her face with infinite tenderness. "I never thought I'd have this chance again to build a family, to pass on a legacy. After losing everyone, I convinced myself it was better not to want it, not to hope for it." "And now," Margaret prompted, her own joy reflected in his shining eyes. "Now I thank God every day for sending you to that train station," Mitch said fervently, "for giving me the courage to claim you that day." He kissed her then, a kiss filled with promise and gratitude, and a love that had grown stronger than either of them had dared to hope for when they had entered their marriage of convenience. As the months passed, Margaret's body changed, the new life within her making its presence known in increasingly obvious ways. Mitch was endlessly attentive, insisting she rest more, arranging for additional help at the store, and spending hours building a cradle from the finest wood he could obtain. "It's beautiful," Margaret said as she ran her hand over the smooth curves of the finished cradle placed proudly in their bedroom. "A true heirloom." "First of many," Mitch replied, his hand coming to rest on her rounded abdomen. "Just like this little one will be." The town of Silver Creek embraced the news of the coming Blackwood heir with enthusiasm. Martha Wilson organized a gathering of women to prepare baby clothes and blankets. The town council, at Mitch's urging, approved the funding for a proper schoolhouse, to be built the following spring. "We're investing in the future," Mayor Forbes declared at the announcement, "not just in buildings, but in our children and their children after them." As summer turned to fall, Margaret found herself reflecting on the extraordinary journey of the past year. From the desperate bride shivering on the train platform to the contented wife, and soon-to-be mother she had become, the transformation seemed almost miraculous. October arrived with the golden light and crisp air that heralded Wyoming's brief but glorious autumn. Margaret's time grew near, and Mitch became increasingly protective, rarely letting her out of his sight. "I'm perfectly fine," she assured him as they sat on the porch one evening, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time." "I know," Mitch acknowledged, his hand covering hers where it rested on her swollen belly, "but none of them have been carrying my child, my miracle." The baby, a son they named James Samuel Blackwood, arrived on a clear, cold night in late October, almost exactly 1 year after Margaret had first arrived in Silver Creek. The birth was difficult but ultimately uncomplicated, with Martha Wilson assisting her husband and Mitch pacing the hallway outside until Doc Wilson finally invited him in to meet his son. "He's perfect," Mitch whispered, tears streaming unashamedly down his face as he cradled the tiny bundle. "Margaret, he's absolutely perfect. He has your eyes," Margaret observed tiredly, watching the two most important people in her world with a heart so full it seemed it might burst. "And your strong chin." "Poor child," Mitch joked, though his voice was thick with emotion. "Let's hope he has your brains and your kind heart to compensate." As winter once again settled over the Circle B, the Blackwood household adjusted to its newest member. James proved to be a good-natured baby, his serious blue eyes taking in the world around him with an intensity that reminded Margaret of his father. On Christmas Eve, as they sat before the fire in the parlor, James sleeping peacefully in his cradle beside them, Mitch took Margaret's hand in his. "I have something for you," he said, producing a small package wrapped in silver paper. Margaret unwrapped it carefully to find a velvet box. Inside lay a ring set with a perfect sapphire surrounded by diamonds. "Mitch," she breathed, stunned by the unexpected gift. "It's exquisite." "I should have given you a proper ring when we married," Mitch said, taking the ring from the box and sliding it onto her finger beside the simple gold band she already wore. "But our marriage wasn't exactly conventional." "No," Margaret agreed with a smile, "but I wouldn't change a moment of it." Mitch's expression grew serious as he held her gaze. "When I met you at that train station, I was acting out of duty and obligation. I never imagined that the shivering bride waiting there would become the center of my world, the heart of my home." Margaret felt tears welling in her eyes at his words. "And I never imagined that the stern cowboy who claimed me would become the love of my life, the father of my child." "I love you, Margaret Elizabeth Blackwood," Mitch said solemnly, the words he had never directly spoken before now flowing easily from his heart. "With everything I am and everything I have, I love you." "And I love you, Mitchell James Blackwood," Margaret replied, her voice steady despite her tears. "More than I ever believed possible." As their lips met in a kiss that sealed their declaration, little James stirred in his cradle, reminding them of the new life they had created together, the future they would build side by side. Outside, snow began to fall softly, covering the Circle B in a blanket of pristine white, while inside, the warmth of love and family kept the darkness at bay. The shivering bride who had waited at the station, abandoned and alone, had found not just shelter, but a love worth crossing a continent for, a love that would endure through all the seasons of their lives together.